Introducing myself again, I'm Babak Ashuri. I'm professor here at Georgia Tech and executive director of our professional master's degree in occupational safety and health. Welcome, everybody. This is our first in the spring series of safety speaker series presented to you by PMOSH program, professional master's degree in occupational safety and health. It's a multidisciplinary program. It's a graduate degree from Georgia Tech. It's almost totally online with a few touch points here and there that we would like to see our students on campus, but 100% online, 10 courses, one course at a time. So you would have a chance to take a course, all the 10 courses throughout the 2 year. Most of our students, almost all of them, are professionals in safety, occupational safety and health, and use this degree as a leg up in their professional career. So the degree prepares them for accepting much higher leadership positions in the field of occupational safety and health. Our former alumni include people who are safety director or regional director or defining policy for professional safety and occupational safety and health. So as far as the program, as I said, it's a 2 year program, graduate degree from Georgia Tech, taught by people who have been there, who have been in the field, who have done that, who are doing that as their day-to-day job, as well as it has the academic excellence of a tier 1 research university like Georgia Tech. Our program accredited by Board of Certified Safety Professionals, and you would gain the graduate safety practitioner GSP designation in addition to your PMOSH degree. But moving forward, as far as today, we are really fortunate to have Mr. Kirk Mahan. He is the Director of Safety Excellence at Georgia-Pacific in the Safety Support Center. Kirk has more than 25 years of experience with Georgia-Pacific. He has overall 35 years experience as a safety professional, as an engineer. Previously, he was on the staff for Georgia Tech for 9 years. He was one of us where he directed courses and taught in the OSHA Training Institute Education Center located in our university. He's currently under Enterprise Innovation Group. He also developed technical assistance to more than 1,000 facilities regarding safety and health management, hazard identification, and risk mitigation and compliance. Prior to Georgia Tech, Kirk working for textile and construction industry as an engineer. Mr. Mahan is a registered professional engineer and a certified safety professional, CSP. He serves on the Occupational Safety and Health Steering Committee for the National Safety Council Network. He's a member of the Institute of Industrial and Systems Engineering and a professional member of the American Society of Safety Professionals, ASSP. Kirk holds a bachelor from Industrial Engineering at Georgia Tech and a master's degree in Business Administration from Georgia State University. Without any further ado, the floor is yours, Kirk, and we are really happy to have you around. And by the way, for the audience, use the chat box to put your questions. Towards the end, we can open up for some more discussion and some more questions. Thank you, Kirk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And it's exciting to be with a bunch of techies again. It was a wonderful time of my life. I thoroughly enjoyed working there at the Institute, and I'm excited to spend a little bit of time with you guys today. So I will, let's see, I need to share my screen. So if y'all will bear with me just a little bit. I'm more used to Teams than I am Zoom. Okay, so maybe somebody could tell me that they can see that.
Yeah, we can see your slides. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. So just using that, I think there's a hand raise feature in Zoom. How many of you have ever heard of human and organizational performance before? Anyone? Okay, I see some thumbs going up here. All right, very good. So I'm seeing a few, but not a whole lot. So hopefully I'll give you a little bit of a taste. There we go. There's a lot more thumbs going up now. So hopefully by 1 o'clock we'll have a little bit better understanding of human and organizational performance. Just wanted to tell you real quickly who in the world is Georgia-Pacific. Hopefully it's a company you've heard of. It's a forest products manufacturer that started nearly 100 years ago out east of Atlanta in Augusta, Georgia. It's now headquartered in Atlanta, and we make just about anything you can from a tree or recycled fiber. We got about 25,000 employees and about 150 manufacturing locations. We do have 3 major business units, consumer products, building products, and then packaging. And so hopefully some of these products are in your homes. I know they're in a number of the organizations, the businesses, the airports, the hotels that you're traveling across. But anyway, that's who Georgia-Pacific is. And actually the way I came to be at Georgia-Pacific was while I was at Georgia Tech. Georgia-Pacific was one of our primary contracts that we were doing a lot of training for, and just had an opportunity to go over and work for Georgia-Pacific about 25 years ago. And I've enjoyed it just like I enjoyed my time at Georgia Tech. And so there's just a quick example of our manufacturing locations across the United States. And you can see they're kind of located where the wood basket is, so to speak, where the trees are. So let's move on into the topic, and that is human and organizational performance, also known as HOP. And this is certainly not a topic that Georgia-Pacific invented. It's something that we came across several years ago. In fact, it was about 2016 when we started to adopt and added this to part of our strategy. So this is our overall safety strategy at Georgia-Pacific that our leadership has established for us. And so you can see the leadership, the vision that our company leaders provide for us is the top piece there. The second piece that we added, and we actually added this back in 2013, and that's critical hazard risk reduction. And that's where we changed our focus to really focus on serious injury and fatality prevention, trying to identify those critical hazards that led to the majority of our fatalities and serious injuries. And then the piece that we kind of decided that we were really missing, that was going to truly drive excellence in our performance, was this final piece, human and organizational performance. So if we think about just some of looks like the animation won't work, but that's okay. We'll walk through this. If any of you have been in the industry for any length of time, or if you've done any look at safety history, you recall that 20, 30 years ago, incident rates, that was really the only metric that we had out there. And so the way that industry and government really started to address this proliferation of injuries in the workplace was through compliance. So let's issue rules and such. And so there was very rapid, very significant improvement in safety performance, but it started to plateau. And so around the turn of the century, that's when you really started to have a lot of employers start to embrace process safety. They started to look more at risk assessments and look at things from the standard that was issued pretty close to that time, that process safety management standard. And so again, we saw a number of years of improvement, but once again, performance plateaued. And so the piece that seemed to be missing that would really start to get us off of this plateau again was the human and organizational performance path. And like I said, GP did not invent this. This is something that's been around for 40 plus years. And really, if you think about the nuclear industry as a result of things like the 3 Mile Island disaster, more recently Chernobyl, if you think about the aviation industry, if you think about the military, or if you think about the automobile industry, all of those industries were early adopters and actually creators of this philosophy known as human and organizational performance. And just one that probably all of us have experienced before. If we're at a let's say we're at a dinner party or something, and we're talking to one another, and you happen upon a surgeon, and just in society we tend to think of surgeons as some of the most highly educated, highly trained individuals in our society, yet they make mistakes too. So if someone is smart and as brilliant as a surgeon can make a mistake, then somebody like me, just a goofy safety professional, what kind of chance do I have at trying to avoid mistakes that lead to loss of limb or loss of life? And so here's just a silly little example. I'm sure some of you have had surgeries in your past, and just say that maybe they're going to do a shoulder repair or something. I've got a torn rotator cuff I need to have worked on, but when I go in for surgery, it's not unusual for them to use a Sharpie to mark which body part they're going to be working on. Pretty low-tech solution, but the reason they do that is because there have been plenty of cases, plenty of incidents where these highly trained, highly skilled, highly educated professionals have made a mistake. They've worked on the wrong body part. They've amputated the wrong body part. So if they're building in some sort of controls to try to prevent or overcome those mistakes, then that seems like a good philosophy that really all of us, particularly employers, could be adopting. And here's another example. I mentioned that the automobile industry is one where they were an early adopter of these concepts. And so here is just a graph. You can read the source there at the bottom, but if we look at the death rate versus the number of vehicle miles traveled over the last 100+ years, the death rate, of course, started off very high 100 years ago. Even though there were very few miles being driven, there just weren't that many automobiles. But over time, that death rate has plummeted while the number of vehicle miles being traveled has just grown exponentially. Well, what changed in that amount of time? In fact, I'll pause for a second. If anybody would like to answer, maybe put it in the chat. What has changed in the last 100 years to bring down that death rate? I'm not able to see your chat. If anybody would like to read me some of the chats.
Safety improvement,
Okay.
technological advancement, seat belts, airbags, better construction.
Okay. Yeah, all of those absolutely changed in the last 100 years. So just like you said, I mean, think about, it's kind of hard for us to even understand this, but 100 years ago, there weren't even roads in many cases. I mean, that's kind of how we ended up with 1,000 peach trees in downtown Atlanta. Peachtree Street, Peachtree Lane, Peachtree Boulevard. All of those came from just wherever somebody used to take their wagon cart down through there. So we actually have roads now. Think about tires. There were wooden or metal tires originally. Now we've got high performance steel reinforced rubber tires. So something as simple as that. Things like seat belts, rumble strips, airbags, all of those are improvements that drove down that death rate while increasing the number of vehicle miles traveled. The thing that has not changed is the driver. Now, of course, we do have driver's education available. Schools seem to be backing away from that a little bit, but the person themselves has not changed in that last 100 years. It's just the controls that have been put in place have improved. So another term that's sometimes used for human and organizational performance is safety differently, or sometimes it's called the new view of safety. And this particular comparison comes from a fellow by the name of Dr. Todd Conklin, and he is an academic practitioner from Los Alamos out in New Mexico. And he's actually one of the folks that's one of the pioneers in human and organizational performance. And he's the primary person that Georgia-Pacific has used to develop our strategy. But anyway, this little side-by-side comparison shows the historical view of safety, the traditional view of safety, versus this HOP or safety differently. So under the old way of thinking, workers are the problem to be fixed, and we fix safety by making workers better. Well, how do we think that's going to work? How much success have any of us ever had in making a person better? It's very difficult, nearly impossible to do that. So safety differently, the new view, HOP, teaches us that workers aren't the problem, they're the problem solvers. So the employees are the folks that we should be gathering information from about the work processes. The traditional view told us that we must tell workers what to do, and perhaps more importantly, what not to do. Whereas HOP teaches us we don't tell our organizations what to do, but we ask them what they need. And that's a lot more beneficial in helping them be successful. And then the last one on this comparison is traditional safety has taught us that safety is the absence of accidents. Well, the new view teaches us it's not the absence of accidents, rather it's the presence of capacity. So just think about those of you who work for larger organizations that perhaps they've got multiple facilities, and maybe some of those facilities have, let's say, an OSHA rate of 0. Well, just having an OSHA rate of 0 doesn't necessarily mean that's a safe facility. It just means that they've not had an event occur that met the OSHA record-keeping criteria. So just because they have a 0, we don't really know if they're safe or not. So that's a really poor definition of safety. So the new view teaches us that the definition, a better definition, is capacity, and specifically the capacity to fail safely. Now, this really becomes difficult for practitioners, safety practitioners that have really been around for a while, like myself, because we've been so ingrained, so taught to look at that incident rate to determine winners and losers. But just like I said, just because it's a 0 incident rate doesn't necessarily mean it's a safe facility. So we have historically tried to get rid of all injuries, and that failed just miserably. That's a discussion for a different day. But although we never want someone to be injured, we truly want no one to lose their life or have their life permanently altered in the workplace. And so that's where this capacity to fail safely comes about. I would much rather have somebody suffer a minor cut that required some stitches, some bandaging, rather than them losing a finger. And so the controls for both of those situations are a little bit different, but that's how we can better define safety under the new view. So just a little summary here before we get a little bit deeper. Human and organizational performance. What it is, it's a shift in our thinking. This truly is a different way of thinking. This is not a standard. It's not a training program. It's not a flavor of the month safety effort. It truly is a way of thinking. It's a change in the way that we think. And it's going to take some time. Like I said, we started our effort around 2016. And it all started with having our leaders exposed to the concepts of human and organizational performance. This is a concept that really doesn't work if it's introduced from the ground up, so to speak. This really does need to be a leadership-embraced effort, because frequently when you talk to employees about these concepts, they say, well, no, duh, we could have told you that. We already knew this. We didn't need somebody to come teach us this. This is what we've been asking for. This is what we've been telling. So it's a way to expand our thinking beyond why to how. I know that one of the more common investigation techniques is a 5 why. So this would actually tell us it's better to ask how than to why. We focus on building error-tolerant systems and layers of protection. That's a term that many of you probably heard of before. Sometimes it's called the Swiss cheese model. We're going to focus on safeguards and the capacity to fail safely, but we are not going to make a rule or a standard We're not going to audit facilities against how far along with HOP adoption they are. And it's not a single solution to fatalities or serious injuries. It takes a number of tools, a number of efforts. So GP came up with our own internal 5 concepts of, these are kind of the attributes of what human and organizational performance means to us. If we look at any of the practitioners like Dr. Conklin again, he also has 5 concepts, and these are very similar to his. We just put a little bit of the GP spin on it that it made it a little bit more personal for us. And so I'll quickly touch on each one of these. Typically, we teach this type of a class to our leadership in about 5 hours. So I'm going to try to do it in like 50 minutes. So hold on. The concept number 1, people make mistakes and blame fixes nothing. So that one is fairly straightforward. I think we would all agree that people make mistakes. There's no telling how many mistakes I've made today. There's no telling how many mistakes I'll make during this presentation today. But if we look at some of the historical data, you've probably all heard that left-hand pie chart before, where 90% of events are caused by unsafe behaviors. Maybe that's a way that you've heard it explained before. And although that's true that 90% is error and it tends to be 10% equipment failure, if we really start to look at that 90% human error, the majority of it is actually system induced. We set people up for failure. We gave them a broken system. We gave them a system that predisposed them to making a mistake, having errors, and then ultimately injuring themselves. And so just a little quote from Edward de Bono: mistakes arise directly from the way the mind handles information, not through stupidity or carelessness. And I bet we've all been guilty of seeing someone do something that had negative or unintended consequences or an unintended outcome. And we thought, boy, why would you do that? How could somebody be so stupid? Maybe we didn't vocalize it, but we've probably thought that before. And so what Dr. de Bono here is encouraging us is it's the way that we think. It's not because I'm careless. It's not because I'm stupid. It's biological in essence. And so that leads us to a really important concept here. And this is about just some basics of our brains and where these errors in the workplace come from. And so just to really oversimplify brain biomechanics here, and I'm certainly not a brain scientist or a brain surgeon or even a biologist, but 2 really critical parts of the brain that we want to focus on are the frontal lobe and the cerebellum. So that frontal lobe, that's the slow thinking part of our brain where reasoning and decision making are made, whereas the cerebellum, there at the back of the skull, that's our fast thinking brain where we're have all of our routine tasks, those things that we can do without even thinking about it. All of those come from that cerebellum. So this is a model that comes from Mr. Rasmussen. And so what he came up with was a comparison between the familiarity of a task and the attention that we have to provide. And so this seems fairly straightforward, that the more familiar we are with a task, the less we have to pay attention to it. And so if we're in that level, if we've got that more experienced employee, we're in that fast thinking, we're using that cerebellum, we're using the back of our head, we're in the hardwired, don't even think about it. Whereas if I'm new to the job, I've got to use my frontal lobe. I am not familiar with this task at all, so I've really got to pay attention to what in the world I'm doing. And then we can kind of move up and down this spectrum depending on the task or the job or the role that we're doing. And so we'll all find ourselves in these different buckets from time to time. But just think about, several years ago, I went to Europe. I got a minivan. It was a stick shift minivan, and the steering wheel was on the opposite side. It was on the right-hand side. And oh, by the way, I've got to drive on the left-hand side of the road. So all of those things were brand new to me. Although I've been driving for many, many years, I can drive a stick shift vehicle. I had never driven, well, I'd not driven minivans. I'd certainly not driven a stick shift minivan. And I'd never driven one where I'm having to change gears with my left hand while driving in the left-hand side of the road. So although here at home, I would have been in the skill bucket, as soon as I got over there, I was very much in that knowledge bucket. Now, Rasmussen goes a little bit further and actually finds out some error ratios based on each of these buckets. And so what he finds is when we're at that skill bucket, we make an error or a mistake about 1 in every 10,000 attempts. Now, this is not an injury, it's just an error or mistake. So if I'm skilled at a position, I'm still going to make a mistake about once every 10,000 times. Now, if I'm in that middle ground, I'm pretty proficient, but not exactly, or maybe it's been a while since I've done a task, I'm going to make a mistake about once every 1,000 times. Now, let's look at this last bucket, and this is where it really gets scary. Just think about the number of new employees that all employers have had over the last 4 years. And we certainly do in GP, we have green training green. Maybe some of you've heard that before, where a brand new employee is the most senior employee for a particular department, and they're having to train even newer employees. So everybody is in that knowledge bucket. Well, the ratio here is a terrifying 1 to 2. Every 2 times you do the task, one of them you're going to mess up. It's not you're going to die. It's not you're going to get injured necessarily, but it's going to be a mistake once out of every other time you do it. And that is just a startling statistic that Rasmussen gives us in this mental model. So this is something that I would typically ask for a volunteer, but I'm going to keep going from it. But I'll pause for a second and y'all just read a line or two here. And I'm guessing that you can read it. So I'll stop talking for a second. Okay, so I bet most everybody was able to read it, even though when you look at the words, it's a big old mess. And that's because all of you are very familiar with how to read. So you really just need the first and the last letter. But if we were to ask, let's say a 4-year-old, a preschooler, a kindergartner, for them to read this, how does someone just learning to read? They learn to read by sight. And so if these letters are all a mess, they're not familiar with it, there's going to be a lot of mistakes made. So we can really use that performance modes to think about the background, the experience level of the person, the employee that we're asking to do a particular task. So this leads us to some so-called hazards in our head. And so these are some biases, some error traps, and these are not all inclusive by any means, but these are some of the common ones that we've identified and that we continue to encounter at Georgia-Pacific. But things like perceptual blindness. I mean, just think about in the town where you live. Have they ever changed traffic lights, maybe added a traffic light, installed a stop sign, removed a stop sign, and you still find yourself stopping where the stop sign used to be, or maybe you blew right through a stop sign that was just never there because you've lived in this town for years and years and years, and you know what's there, and it's not a stop sign, but yet someone put one up and now we've missed it. A micro sleep. This is a pretty interesting one. It's not as easy to explain now that so many folks are home-based, but think about when you've had a job where you had to drive to work and then drive back home. How many times have you driven home from work or school or wherever it might be, and all of a sudden you're home and you don't really remember driving from work or school or wherever it was? You're just all of a sudden you're there. And it's because you're so familiar with that task that your brain went on autopilot. That cerebellum kicked in and you took a little micro sleep. Well, that happens at work too. Even though we have extremely experienced employees doing a particular task, perhaps they've done it so many times that they're able to just rely on the cerebellum, rely on that hardwiring at the back of the brain, and they just take that little micro sleep. Situational blindness is where you're given a mission and you're so focused on that mission that you miss other things that are really important. And I've got a personal example for you here. Back when I was a kid, we used to go to my grandparents' house for Easter every year. And we'd had all the cousins and the neighborhood kids, and we'd go on this Easter egg hunt. And there were probably 1,000 eggs out in my grandparents' yard. Well, this one particular Easter, we're all out there. We run through the yard, we get all the eggs, and everybody comes back, and we're doing a count. And the adults decide, okay, well, let's go take a look and see if they got all the eggs out of the yard. Well, within just a few feet of stepping off of the driveway, which was kind of the start and stop line, the start and finish line for our Easter egg hunt, there was this huge snake in the grass, just feet from where all of these children had been running. In fact, we had all stepped right over this snake. But that wasn't our mission. Our mission was go find the eggs. We were situationally blind to this enormous snake laying right here in the grass. And we can have that happen at the workplace too. Optimism bias. Here's another one that most all of us have probably experienced before. I bet a lot of us will make a to-do list for the weekend. Maybe I've got a lot of projects I want to do. I want to repair the toilet and cut the grass and wash the car and take the dog to the vet, whatever it might be. And so every Friday you make out your to-do list, and come Monday morning, how much of that to-do list got done? If you're like me, you're much more optimistic about what you can get done than your actual abilities are. And so we're all guilty of that one. Confirmation bias is where we just reason away any outliers that might be out there. Anything that does not support my belief or my opinion, I just completely ignore it. I put on blinders so I can't see it. And then this last one, this is one of my favorites, fundamental attribution error. If I make a mistake, it was truly a mistake. But if you make a mistake, it's because you're a dummy. Now just think about, have you ever been cut off in traffic? And just think about the times when you've been cut off. What was your thought of that other driver? What were you mumbling under your breath, or what were you thinking? Maybe what were you yelling? Well, you idiot, don't you know how to drive? But then I bet almost every one of us has probably cut someone off before. And when I cut somebody off, it's, oh man, I am so sorry. I never saw you. That was a mistake. I sure am sorry about that. But since it was me, it was just a mistake. But if it's you, it's because you have no clue how to drive. That's fundamental attribution error. Well, what's all this mean? Well, errors will happen, and we can't fix people. Remember back to our side-by-side columns, we can't fix people. So we won't eliminate these types of biases or these error traps, these hazards in our head. But if we can anticipate them, we can build systems that take these errors into account, and we can better design our systems with controls that give us capacity to fail safely. There's that term again. Now, here's another quote from Dr. Todd Conklin. You can either blame or you can learn, but you can't do both. And Conklin talks about this a lot. You can blame or learn, but you can't do both. Now, blaming typically feels good, but we don't really get better by blaming somebody, because as soon as we blame somebody, as soon as I've been blamed for something, I shut off all communication. I'm not going to help you learn about why I did what I did or how I did what I did. So we can blame, we can learn, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do both. Now, here's another model, and we actually developed this one in cooperation with Chevron. So I don't know, we may have some folks from Chevron on the call with us. So thank you, Chevron, if you're there. And this one often gets pretty controversial, particularly with new leaders in our company or with folks that have just never been exposed to human and organizational performance. And so we find that performance kind of falls into three buckets, or unwanted performance falls into three buckets. And I'm going to start over on the far right-hand side, and that's with sabotage. Now, sabotage is where somebody intentionally did an act and intended to cause harm. Well, that's a criminal act and should be dealt with immediately and swiftly by your human resources function, and perhaps even by the police if it's that big of a situation. In fact, I've encountered that one time in my career with Georgia-Pacific where there was an intention to cause harm. So we had a sabotage event. Where things typically fall are in these other two buckets, either an error or a violation. Now, an error is just an action or an inaction that was taken unintentionally that led to a deviation or an undesirable outcome, whereas a violation is an intentional act or an intentional inaction that deviated from a rule. And just on the surface, you'd think, well, violation, then that person deserves to be punished. But let's use all of us again, for example. Now, I won't necessarily ask you to raise your hand here, but have any of you ever sped? Have you found yourself in your car speeding? You've been out on the interstate and you've exceeded the speed limit. I bet almost all of us have done this before. Sometimes you didn't know you were speeding. You didn't know what the speed limit was, or maybe you just were distracted. Maybe you had a crying child in the backseat. Maybe you were listening to your favorite song. Who knows what? And so you didn't realize that you were breaking the speed limit. But there are times where you know the speed limit, but there's really not much traffic out here. It's a sunny day. Got brand new tires on my car. We're headed to Florida for vacation. I really want to get there. So I know the speed limit's 70, but I'm just going to set the cruise control for 80. That's a violation. I intended to break a known safety rule. Now, don't fall into that fundamental attribution error trap again, but our employees, even though there's a written procedure, even though there's a written rule, from time to time, they will deviate from that rule because it made sense at the time. So even though unintended or intentional falls into one of these buckets, we still need to learn. Now, that doesn't mean that ultimately we can't have some punitive discipline take place, but it means we need to learn first, because if we just immediately suspend or terminate that employee, then all learning has stopped. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this model, but it's just showing a side-by-side comparison just to reinforce that point of accountability. Sometimes people, when they hear HOP, think, well, that means it's a free-for-all. We can't hold anybody accountable. And that's not true at all. We just want to learn first, and then we take appropriate actions. So many times employers want to rely on safety to take care of their problem employees. If you have a performance problem with an employee, it's not necessarily a safety issue, but it's easy to justify terminating, disciplining someone because of a safety rule. But it's really contrary to human and organizational performance. And that's what that model was saying. Our second concept, we seek learning opportunities that allow us to build capacity to fail safely. Now, what Conklin says here is events aren't predictable, but the conditions that create events are. So if I knew with 100% certainty I was going to die at work today, guess what? I'm not going to work. We don't have that luxury. but we can look at the conditions that exist at work and say, hey, somebody's going to get hurt out there. That's what this quote is saying. So just a couple of tools that we use to reinforce this concept that I want to share with you. One is called a bow tie. And the bow tie is made up of prevention controls and recovery controls. And right there in the middle of the bow tie, the knot of the bow tie, if you will, is where the work execution takes place, or where that loss of control can occur. So we want to have controls that can prevent the loss of control. But when those controls fail, it's not if, but when those controls fail, we have to have some recovery controls in place so that the consequence is typically a SIF, a serious injury or fatality. We want to recover from that loss of control so it doesn't lead to a fatality. So let's just do the car example again really quick. And let's call the loss of control a car crash. So some of the things that are prevention controls are things like anti-lock brakes, or the rumble strips on the side of the street, or if we have lane deviation or assisted braking. All of those things are prevention controls that help us from losing control of the car. But even with all of those things in place, cars still crash. But the way that we walk away from that crash is we've got some recovery controls too. So we've got things like seat belts, airbags, crumple zones. All of those are the recovery controls that make sure when those prevention controls fail and I crash my car, I don't die. And so years ago, Volvo, for example, their company goal was to come out with a fatality-proof vehicle. And their car, this one particular line, I don't recall which model it was, it has gone over 10 years without a driver fatality. So that's just a great example, a real world example of prevention versus recovery controls. Now here, context influences behavior. And so this is an example of, let's say that we've had an event over here. And if we don't take into account all of the context over here, if we just say, well, why did this happen? We may not learn all of these really important pieces to the story. So what we encourage people to do is to ask better questions. We ask people to tell me about their job, or what could we have done differently, or what does a bad day look like for you, rather than saying, well, did you use the procedure? That's a traditional question. It's actually got blame kind of built into it. Did you do this? Did you follow the rules? So if I've already messed up and now I'm being asked that kind of a question, learning is not going to take place. So it's better to move over to that right-hand side with the better questions. Pardon me. The fourth concept, violations of rules are rarely intended to cause harm and often make sense at the time. So that was what I was saying a little while ago, that even though it's a violation, even though I intended to speed, I never meant to hurt myself or anyone else that was out here. It made sense at the time. Clear day, new tires, low traffic, hurry to get to vacation. So a good tool that we use here is called black line, blue line. The black line is work as planned. That's your SOP. That's your procedure. The blue line is work as performed. So another real world example for you. I bet almost all of us have bought something at IKEA before and we've had to put it together. Well, that instruction book that comes in the box at IKEA, that's the black line. Well, if you're like me, you throw that thing away and you just start putting the bookcase or whatever it is together. That's the blue line. Me just putting stuff together, that's the blue line. Well, normally the blue line is successful, and that's true at work too. Even though we've got an SOP, everybody does the job just a little bit differently, and it's normally successful. But all of the time that we're doing that, this hazard, this red line, the hazard line, is always out there. It's just, fortunately, we typically have a big enough gap between the black line or the blue line and the hazard line. And so over time though, or if we do this enough times, unfortunately that blue line may intersect with the red line. And that's when we have the event. That's when we have the injury. Now, the thing that we need to look at though is sometimes the blue line is better than the SOP. So if that's true, we need to adopt those better practices. The other thing we need to avoid is when the blue line is down here below the black line, if we allow that blue below the black to become the black line, that's called normalization of deviation. Maybe that's a concept that you've heard before. So we've normalized our deviation away from what the SOP says. And that actually often takes us much closer to the hazard. So we have to be constantly aware of that. And here was just a real world example from a community where they had trouble with bikers getting run over by cars at this particular cross section. So they said, well, we know what we'll do. We'll put up this little turnstile where you can't just ride your bike through the intersection now. You'll actually have to get off of your bike and walk it through the turnstile. And that'll make sure that you're seeing if any cars are coming. Well, that's the black line. Well, you can see the real world blue line right over here, which is exactly what I would have done. Just ride over through the grass around the whole safety feature. So we have to be vigilant for those weak signals. There's another term that you may have heard of. Sometimes they're very strong signals. They're not so weak. And then one other tool that we use along these lines is something called a learning team. So rather than using a traditional investigative team, we use something called a learning team where we use those tools. We use the bow tie, we use the black line, blue line, we use better questions to learn about work, learn about the job. And so the way that that learning team works is we talk about, well, tell me about your job. Tell me how you do this particular work. And then we use that information to put together a problem statement. And then we work to find gap closure actions. And then we just continue this cycle of learning. We try those suggestions. If they work, we adopt them. If they don't work, we move on to other ones. But learning teams, we could have a whole session on learning teams. I think this is my last Conklinism for you, but saying an event was caused by human error or not following a procedure is like saying an object fell due to gravity. It's always true. It just doesn't tell us anything. So we're not able to learn just because it's true. So this will be just a real quick example of how that all works if we were doing an investigation. So typically the event happens and then we say, well, what happened? A better way to do it, well, here's what the answer is. Employee's hand was pulled into a pulley causing a laceration. And why? What happened? Well, the employee entered a guarded area at someone else's request. Okay, we're all done. Let's write them up. Let's maybe fire the guy that got hurt and we'll write up the person that told him to go in there. Well, that's not very helpful. That's not going to make us better. It's not going to stop it from happening again. So through better questions, learning from that normal work, now we're able to find out all the answers to these kinds of questions. And so then what we find out is although that operator entered a guarded area because somebody else asked, well, this is all the context about why. Well, the normal partner wasn't there. The guarding area had been entered a lot of times without anybody ever locking it out. It was an 8th-month operator that was asked to enter it by a 38-year employee. So I mean, just think about the psychology of that. I'm a newbie and this veteran employee says, hey, I need you to go in there. Well, I don't want to get fired. And this guy's been here a long time. Let me just go in. So if all we do is end right here with our investigation, we never learn all of this context and we can never increase our capacity to fail safely. We cannot introduce additional controls. Now, the last concept, we're real close here to some question and answer period, is how leaders respond matters. And I've given you a lot of real world examples. I'll give you one more. Think about how many times you've been driving down the interstate and you see a state trooper off on the side of the road. What do? What's your first response? Well, I bet we all kind of ease up on the accelerator. Even if I'm not speeding, it's a 70 and I'm doing 65, you still let off the gas. Our response matters. And so here are some of the common mistakes that leaders make. They look for a single root cause. And although we just talked about it quickly, there is a lot of context out there that suggests it wasn't any one of those things that led to the injury, that led to that laceration. It's all of those things. Believing not following the procedure is why the event occurred. If that's the reason and you stop it right there, you're never going to address all of those other issues that come up. Thinking, well, they should have known better. Well, we've already talked about the brain hazards, that this is biology at work, that we're all wired that way, and that we might not have deviated in this one particular task, but guess what? There's a task out there that I'm going to deviate to. Not bringing the planner and the worker together. Remember our side-by-side comparison of traditional versus safety differently. Not asking the employee. Rushing to fix. We still are guilty of this. We'll have leaders that say, well, we've had an injury. I want a safety alert within 24 hours. Well, what if I don't learn anything in 24 hours? It may take days before I learn the context of a particular event. So we have to resist that rush to fix. And then assuming why we know the event occurred. I've been in plenty of investigations where a supervisor will come in, we've got the team together, and a supervisor will come in and say, well, I'll tell you what happened. Well, okay, we're done learning again because that supervisor has cut us off. So we have to resist all of these traps. And we've actually even adopted a little pocket card. I'll hold it up there. There, I've got mine right here with me, that we've given to all of our leaders, all of our floor leaders, all the way up, just to keep around so that we can help them remember to ask better questions. We've actually put examples of the better questions right on the little card. So if they don't know what to do, it's pretty easy to figure it out on that little card. So those are our 5 concepts. The last thing I was going to leave you with is kind of the next step. Although we started in 2016, we are by no means perfect or done. This is something you never get done on. So we're adopting a maturity model this year, and this comes from Andrea Baker. She's another thought leader in HOP, and she has these kind of sequential parts of where you are with adoption of human and organizational performance. They start off down here, or actually they start at the top and go down. And so we're somewhere in that middle section. I would say, depending on site, depending on business unit, we're one of those shades of purple in the middle there. But we're constantly working to get better at it. And we'd love to talk to any of you who are on your HOP journey and see how it's going and what we can do to accelerate ours. So that was it. Like I said, very quick, 5 hours and 50 minutes. So I'll stop there and see what kind of questions you guys might have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kirk. It was very informative. Let me monitor the Q&A. There is a question from David, were the effects quantifiable since HOP was introduced at Georgia-Pacific? What sort of measurement? I suppose they were talking about the quantifiable measures.
Yeah, that's a great question. And because leaders like numbers, they want to know, are we winning or losing? Exactly. And this one, just like all things safety, it's tough. Remember our definitions of safety: absence of accidents versus presence of capacity. And I would say that we have metrics around activities, number of people trained, number of site HOP coaches, number of learning teams conducted, but those don't really give you a performance number. I would tell you that, and I don't even really want to speak it out loud, but we've not had a fatality in 3 years. And so I'm looking for wood to touch here. There we go. I'm knocking on my desk. So yes, we have seen the intended belief of HOP is that you will reduce and or eliminate serious injuries and fatalities. We've not had a fatality. We still have roughly the same number of serious injuries. Conklin would tell you that even excellent performing companies have these anomalous events, and at some point you do kind of reach as low as you can go. I don't know if I agree with him philosophically there, but it's an interesting discussion to have. But in terms of fatalities, yes, we have very positive quantifiable results.
Yeah, I'd like to, yeah, I don't know, Antoine Shelby has comments regarding, I guess, the OSHA requirements, probably, maybe you can talk about that, because all of these things that you're talking is not just compliance. You want to go above and beyond and
Yes.
position performance as one of the KPIs, safety performance as one of the KPIs. Can you talk a little bit further on that?
Well, sure. OSHA, as you guys know, created back in the early 70s. Most of the standards have not changed significantly in that amount of time. OSHA does not have any standards on human and organizational performance. They're a regulatory agency that issues standards and expects you to comply with, and then they measure the gap against it. This is beyond compliance. Human and organizational performance is not contrary to compliance. It's not contrary to regulation, but it will help lead your organization towards excellent performance. We have struggled in some ways with, of course, thinking about OSHA record keeping. One of the forms is basically an incident investigation report form.
Mhm.
Well, of course, we fill it out. We have to fill that form out, but we still do our learning team types of activities because it's related very specifically to a few categories of causal categories that led to that event from an OSHA record keeping standpoint. But this is actually what helps us learn the context and conditions that we can improve the process overall. So OSHA doesn't prohibit it. They just don't go that far. Now, the good news is OSHA has begun sitting in on some of the association like National Safety Council, ASSP. They have started sitting in on some of those major organizational conversations around HOP, and they are learning about HOP, and they're trying to introduce, to some degree, HOP concepts into some of the revised standards. Lockout, for example, is a standard that's going through a major rewrite right now, and they're taking some of the HOP concepts into consideration. Now we'll have to see what the draft ends up coming out to look like, but it is a little bit encouraging from a regulatory standpoint.
Any other comments and questions before we are wrapping up the presentation? So one last thing I have for you, Kirk, as far as the Georgia-Pacific goes, you guys are, somewhere on the leadership dashboard, if I'm kind of, like on the KPIs that the leadership likes to see on their sort of measurement of the KPI. So safety is up there, and you sort of having that kind of conversation with the operations people, with the maintenance people, with lots of different sides of the company. Am I interpreting it right? In terms of some of your KPIs open up to the CEO level or C-suite level?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And those have really changed in the last 8 years. mean, it was not uncommon prior to 2016 that incident rate, that was the thing that you talked about, that all the leaders knew the incident rate for the company, they knew the incident rate for their business unit, for their sites, they knew that. It's rare that we talk about incident rates now. I mean, it's been years since those conversations have taken place. The metrics that we focus on now are what we call high potential events and high potential conditions. So some people call them PSIFs, potential SIFs, but it's a condition or a near miss, an actual event that it did not lead to a serious injury or fatality, but it did have that potential. So we go through a risk ranking, and if it's a higher critical risk score for that particular condition or event, we measure those, and those are the metrics that leadership really focuses on more than any others. Now, of course, they're aware of how many serious injuries and fatalities we've had as well, but those HPs and HPCs are the ones that really drive leadership activity.
Thank you. And maybe the last final questions. I know we are a little over the time. How did you get that buy-in from the leadership? How was that? How was the perception, and how you kind of, improve that?
Oh, that's a great question. I said we started in 2016. Actually, a year before that, we used to have an annual safety conference. The site safety leader and the site manager from every facility across the company came together in Atlanta for a 3-day safety conference every single year. In 2015, we had a speaker, a guy by the name of Rob Fisher, come in, and that was the first exposure we ever had to human and organizational performance. Leadership, it didn't take. So don't be discouraged if the first time you expose your leaders to this, it doesn't take, because it's uncomfortable. I bet I said some things today that were very uncomfortable. They were hard for me the first few times I heard it, but you just have to continue being exposed to it, continue reading it. So in 2016, we actually had the top of the house. We had the top 50 leaders in GP sit down with Dr. Conklin, and he went through it. And he's heard it all. He's heard every excuse. He's heard every exception. He's heard every complaint, and he knows how to deal with it. So having the leaders with the thought leader in a room, okay, gloves off, go for it. They embraced it. Coming out of that session, the leaders were, not everyone, but the ones that mattered were on board. And then you just continue to expose them to those concepts. And so if you're interested in going down this path, Conklin's got a bunch of books. He's got a bunch of little 5-minute podcasts. I would just listen to those, read those books to get familiar with it, and then maybe give your leader a copy of some of those books. I've got all the books right here. They're right here on my desk. So if you want one to start with that one. I don't know if you can read it. Pre-accident investigations. Start with that one. That's a Conklin book. It's an easy read. It's how long is this? 132 pages long. Easy read.
Yeah. Sounds great. Yeah, Isabel, it's recorded, so the lecture is recorded, and we will be in touch with a copy of that. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kirk. We'll learn a lot from, and thank you for sharing your lifelong career and showing the dedication you have about the field. And it's really at the core shows your value system, taking care of the people. With that, I'd like to conclude today's presentation. But if we have a couple of slides, but Kirk, if you stop sharing your screen, we might have our slides up. Yeah, and I'm asking Kirk or Stephanie to share that. But by the way, I want to say we are in the midst of recruiting for the next cohort who starts in 2024, August 2024 cohort for our professional master's degree in occupational safety and health. So please submit your application as early as you can. We have March 1st as our soft deadline, and the real deadline is May 1st. We already had a record number of applications, and we are getting back to you very quickly. Once you submit your application, you would receive the response from us. Each application will be reviewed holistically. The other things I would like to mention that please join us. We have a couple of great speakers coming up, one in late March and the other one in mid-April. The late March one is with Mr. Stephen Irving. He is with the Pekar and Abramson. He's a lawyer practicing, attorney practicing, particularly in the construction and infrastructure business. Pekar and Abramson is probably one of the largest law firms dedicated to the construction and infrastructure industry. Of course, they do businesses in other parts, but they are very prominent in that domain. And he's going to talk about the nuance of the OSHA 2024, what you should expect, and what are sort of the understanding from the federal and the state mandate for the PMOSH, for the OSHA programs. And then we would have a person from the military for talking about, people who are serving our country. We would have Mr. Brandon Doherty, and he's a chief in aviation system safety in U.S. Army Aviation and Missile Command, and he will be talking about some of the emerging technologies that deploy for the proactive risk management practices in Army Aviation. So join us on that, mark your calendar. The further information would be coming up. And with that, once again, Kirk, thank you. We always are proud of our Yellow Jacket alum, and you are one of the best. Thank you again for spending time with us. And with that, I conclude our presentation, and thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully see you next month.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody. Have a
Thanks,
great day.
everybody.
Thank you, team.